All right, welcome everyone. It is August 12th, 2021, and you are gathered with the Athens-Clarke County Mayor and Commission for our second work session of the week. Tonight we'll be discussing potential TSPLOST expenditures on Atlanta Highway, on Lexington Highway, discussing on a very high level view our process for American Rescue Plan funding, which will be the subject of a day-long gathering next Friday. And we'll be discussing potential requests of our legislative delegation to the Georgia General Assembly. So I hope all is doing well. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Manager Williams so he can introduce key staff who's going to talk to us about some opportunities with our corridors with these TSPLOST funds.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everybody. Yes, we're here tonight to talk about some priority projects from the good work that the committee's been doing on both the Atlanta Highway and Lexington Road corridors. Of course, those are supported by some 2018 TSPLOST funds. So the good news is the projects coming to you, there is some funding to help support them. And so the committee's looking to you for some guidance on those priority projects. And I will turn it over to Derek Doster with our SPLOST staff.
Thank you, Manager Williams. Go ahead and share our presentation tonight. In an effort to try to mitigate some time, we've combined the both the programs, and we'll, as from Tuesday night, we'll try to not read every slide and get through it in a quick manner to give everybody as much time for questions and be respectful for everybody's evening. Again, as Manager Williams said, this is the Lexington Highway Corridor and Atlanta Highway Corridor projects. We have our typical purpose agenda tonight, just to review the meat and potatoes of the project and where we are this evening. Many of you know and have seen this slide before. Our user group members for both Atlanta Highway and Lexington and supporting staff and departments. History starts around in 2013 with the Urban Land Institute reports that were completed, and we've just moved forward from that time, and I won't read those, but you've had those in advance. And just a reminder, most of our materials are on our SPLOST website, so you can go back and review any of those old history reports at any time. Would like to quick mention about our public engagement strategies. I think if this was not the most public engagement that we've taken on any projects in the county, I think it's at least definitely in the top 4 or 5. We had a significant online presence, combined 8 drop-in and pop-up tents, and just had several other opportunities that we went out and put material into the community and met with different groups. Just a quick slide on Lexington Highway. These were the approved potential projects that you approved in the past that we were working off this list to move forward. These are some general conceptual estimates for that list that you had previously approved. Yeah, we won't move through. This was where general locations of the maps were for Lexington Highway, and these are the project lists for that you approved that we worked off of from this list forward to develop our recommendation that you'll see in a little bit. Again, some conceptual cost estimates for the Atlanta Highway area, just like Lexington, and the general map location where those projects were spread out. All right, getting to the good stuff. Specifically speaking onto the Lexington Highway corridor, the user group, when we went through the previous corridor studies, the input sessions, the public engagement surveys, and their internal collaboration, they divided up what they wanted to prioritize into categories, and you'll see this on Lexington as well. On Atlanta Highway as well, excuse me. That they have project category selections, and then they scored a rank in each category for the particular projects. They did not want to, and they didn't feel it was appropriate to generate a full 1 through project 22 list as a comparison, because they felt it really did not too many competing interests on a lot of those projects. And when we went through this, just as a reminder, when we went through these projects in the prioritization, we really tried to do it based on the input, and cost was not really a consideration at the time. So that was how they maneuvered through the process to develop these projects list. So you can see heavily that Lexington Highway was bike ped, and then intersection, bus transit, and airport in the categories. And then the bike ped projects, the ranking is to the right, and to the left is just the project descriptions. And generally, the top down from L17 down to L15 is generally a continuous sidewalk effort on the south side of Lexington Highway. Just to kind of orientate you to that. Oh, I'm sorry. The intersection improvements, Gaines School, Cherokee Road, they felt was their highest priority for that category or project inside that category. Bus transit, several bus project or bus transit stops they identified for improvement, and they're listed there. And then we had 2 airport projects. You can see the priority on those. And at the end of the deliberation and the work that the user group had done, they developed this list that they want to move forward as the project concepts. The Gaines School Road, Cherokee Road, Lexington Road intersection. However, that's a large project, knowing that the funding is limited on what the TSPLOST can afford. They recommend this to be a partial project concept. And what they mean by that is they want to put the money in there to complete the preliminary design and possibly acquire the necessary right of way so they can move that into a future project, future construction budget opportunities. And even though it's an intersection improvement, and the category that they provided was the highest priority category was bike ped. This is where the collaboration of different projects come in. They want to make sure that there's collaboration with the Cherokee Road multi-use path improvements there. So they want that collaboration there. So that's why they wanted to incorporate this project into a priority list. However, have it limited or partial, as I had spoke before. And the next several projects are, again, sidewalks down the south side of Lexington Road, Lexington Highway. The one project that they did want to try to get into or get in on the list was updating the sidewalk selection between the diversion center and the police department. When the diversion center residents leave the facilities, a lot of times they'll run across the highway, and a lot of times they're leaving early in the mornings or it's dark, and it's a potentially a dangerous situation, I should say. So they wanted to make sure that they could try to work that area as much as possible and make connectivity to the sidewalk that's up there at the police department. The project number 7 was the airport entrance road. And again, this was at a partial, and this is for collaboration purposes to try to complete the preliminary design for that area that has a potential access road to the airport due to the one to possibly protect that right-of-way purchase, because it's a small section of land from the road back to where the county owns property. And then also collaboratively work with the development that for the rezone for the apartments that are across the street. If a light needs to go in, felt that that was an appropriate manner to try to collaborate there and make sure that that works together. And again, that's a partial or a limited effort on that airport entrance road, just to try to get the design and possibly the right of way taken care of there. And then the last one, again, another partial section or another partial intersection improvement would be Jail Road and Lexington Road. And again, that ties into bike ped or pedestrian crossing the road in a manner that comes out of the jail, or possibly connectivity down to the diversion center for those residents. All right. I won't go through the slides. I know they were provided, so I'll try not to talk you through those. And then the Lexington Road corridor projects, the recommended project concepts, again, these are conceptual concept estimates about the effort that they would like to put forward, is seen below, and it roughly works out to about $2.7 million worth of effort out of our project budget. And you can see our typical breakdown of what that money would go for and how it would be dispersed. Right. And then quickly moving to the Atlanta Highway corridor.
Derek, maybe we'll go ahead and stop on Lexington and kind of get some geographic specific input there, and then move on to Atlanta Highway. And maybe if you could put the project slide up, that might be the best thing to orient everyone to. So any thoughts, questions about this project list? I know you got this earlier via email.
And so the project list that we're seeing here, this is sort of the, it's listed it's sort of ranked by priority. Is that my understanding?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so this is like, all right. I mean, and I will just say it's a piece of positive feedback. I think this reflects very well a lot of the community input I have heard regarding priorities with on this corridor. So that's something really exciting to see. I don't have anything else at this time.
Mr. Mayor, one comment I would like to make while looking at this project budget is the conceptual cost estimates for the construction of the sidewalk areas. Give some credit to our Transportation and Public Works team in their efforts of working with Georgia DOT. These would be local dollars only, and that would allow us to not build out a full standard highway design, if you would, that normally GDOT would require. So they understand there's needs for these sidewalks and small minor safety improvements. And if we spend our local dollars, they will work with us on where we can, but not adhere to the state and federal typical roadway designs. For example, where the ditches are now, not trying to put the full shoulders in, just understanding that we could get a sidewalk on the back of the right of way or just close to the right of way, and they would allow us to work with, or they would work with us on that to make sure. But if we had asked for federal or state funding to go along with that, these estimates would not apply to these projects, because they would want a full build out and bringing that roadway section up to current standards. And y'all are all aware of how expensive that could be.
Potentially with curb and gutter and all of those other components that would drive the cost up dramatically.
Yes, sir.
Rather than just having 5 foot wide sidewalk. Has there been some conversation, Derek, about potential use of tax allocation district dollars to conjoin with some of these? You mentioned earlier the Cherokee Road multi-use path, and when we didn't allocate funds for construction of that several months back, part of that was with the notion that in the future we would be able to avail ourselves of some tax allocation district dollars. And so I always wonder in terms of putting projects on the ground at the same time and being able to deploy one team, if there'd been some conversation about that.
We did have the opportunity to meet with ILCA and the TAD in the area, or for the project area, and we identified the projects that we were looking at. They were very pleased with the effort that was moving forward and the types of projects. However, I don't believe, and I'd have to refer back to the manager's office, I did not receive any information, for a commitment or a recommendation from the TAD on that. However, we did make that presentation.
I would just recommend to the manager and key staff who engage with the tax allocation district resident committee that it may be an opportune time to talk about what public amenities that they would like to see built out within that district, so that if we are going to engage a construction crew, maybe we couple some of these that are funded through TSPLOST with some that are funded through TAD revenue.
Yes, sir. Just continue to build on that collaborative effort. Yes, sir.
Sure. Any other questions about Lexington or thoughts about this before we move on to Atlanta Highway?
I have a question, I think, just to build off of your question, Mayor. And I know it's early on here, but is there going to be a TSPLOST 2023 proposal coming forward to kind of build off of what's going on in these corridor? I guess maybe if the manager's office knows if staff has put forward, because I'm thinking about the next funding bucket, for the Lexington and Gaines School intersection and such.
My understanding is that I'd have to go back and look at the what's been provided so far, but we talked about this Monday, Derek. I think that the committees had thought about submitting some additional funding requests. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. They've thought about that, and I believe that they're working on a few of those. I'd have to confirm what their appetite is for the final submission.
Okay. Well, it's helpful to know and have in the back of our head.
Anything else on Lexington before we talk about Atlanta Highway?
I just got one question. The total here is still about $1 million shy of what's remaining in the total bucket. Is there an idea of where that remainder would go? And like, why not allocate it to other projects on this list, or is it to kind of buffer out in case there's unforeseen costs?
Typically, we'd want to hold that construction contingency money to buffer any cost there. Of course, public art funding. There's other aspects of it. We've set aside $250,000 for land acquisition. So there's several components of that. Some of these kind of get realigned through the course of further maturing the projects in the priority list as they move forward. However, it's in all projects, the total project budget encompasses all the different types of activities, not just construction.
So is it safe to say that that remaining amount in the overall project of Lexington Highway Corridor would be used to complete the things on this list? Property acquisition to make them happen, for example.
Yes, like for land acquisition, the $250,000 that's designated there could go to any of those projects as they mature.
Okay, yeah.
And then, Derek, should there be some remaining funds in these buckets, you'd return to us for additional direction.
Yes, sir. If we could build out everything on the list or do the list, but again, we'll continue to mature these and bring that back to the preliminary plan phase. So we'll give you an update on our cost estimates at that time. However, at the end of the day, if there's remaining funds, we will, seek direction from the manager's office and mayor and commission to either continue to move on those projects, or if there's like remnant money left, not much, several times y'all will reallocate those within the SPLOST program, and that's at y'all's discretion. Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. All right, let's take a look at the other end of the highway. Go ahead.
Question, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Mr. Doster, I'm looking at the Gaines School Cherokee Road intersection, and I was hoping you could tell me why that looks the way it does. Why is it not a square there, or just more of a square? I know the roads aren't quite right angles there, but it's kind of like a
funky alignment.
You got several turn lanes on the main line, and you don't have quite as many turn lanes on the approach zones, and then trying to buffer out those corners. Those corners where they are. If you square up, say like the crosswalk across Cherokee Road at the top or the north, if you square that up, make that more 90-degree, you just push your stop lines, your stop bars back up the road a little bit. Again, this is a conceptual level, and if that was, a high priority or something, we could look at squaring that up a little bit. It just would push the stacking distance back probably another car or two.
Well, I guess what's the harm of pushing back the stacking distance?
It depends on how you look at it, but relatively there's no harm.
Okay.
You got a driveway there at Crystal's as well. So, we can get our traffic engineer to respond to that. Commissioner Edwards, if you'd like us to give you some specific feedback on that.
Yeah, I guess when I see a design like that, I just like clarity to be sure that we're building these crosswalks and these pedestrian amenities with pedestrians in mind first, not so much, the comfort of cars first. This is a high traffic pedestrian area, so I just really want to get the absolute best design with pedestrians in mind, pedestrian safety in mind, is the top priority. So
that's good feedback.
Yeah.
That's good feedback. Thank you.
Thanks.
Everybody ready to move on to Atlanta Highway? All right, go right ahead, Derek.
All right, thank you. We'll jump down there and get to the All right, on the Atlanta Highway corridor, very similar process. Both groups adopted that. However, this had one category less, but of course, because there's no airport on this side of town. And so, again, the highest priority ranking project category was bike ped, intersection improvement, and then bus transit. Several bike pedestrian projects were in there. Some of these are a little bit of a double duty, if you would. Several same locations. However, there's a distinction between a multi-use path width versus a sidewalk. So there's several areas in here that kind of, if that was a little confusing, we apologize, but that was the distinction between one. It was a multi-use path and a sidewalk for the same real estate. But you can see that there's the priority list there for the bike pedestrian. The intersection improvements, the realignment, Atlanta Highway, Mitchell Bridge, Timothy Road was the #1 project in that category. And then bus transit, several of the bus transit projects actually fall within the future DOT work out in that corridor. So I think a lot of, a large majority, or at least over half of these projects will be taken care of by the DOT effort when it does move forward. And that was important to the user group, not trying to put resources in that may get torn up in the next several years. And so the user group, at the end of the day, again, building on collaboration and future forward thinking with bike pedestrian, the user group recommends 2 projects. A multi-use path for the Timothy Road to Epps Bridge to State Route 10 loop, or what budget is available to do that, and then Mitchell Bridge Road from Middle Oconee to Westchester to tie that in together. And both of these groups, both of these projects fit into partial completion of the pedestrian loop idea that was introduced, I believe last year or a little bit before last year. It's moving along. These are the multi-use trail general locations. Timothy Road and the north side of Timothy Road, and down towards the loop. Mitchell Bridge, north side of Mitchell Bridge, picking up there at Westchester, and getting down to the Middle Oconee River. And again, from a construction standpoint, here's our recommended project concept cost. The multi-use trail for Timothy at about $1.7 million allocation, or the total length is almost 2 miles. But then, if the budget doesn't allow that, then get what we can. Again, it's a long-term commitment and then continuous use. And then on the Mitchell Bridge Road side, about 2,200 linear feet with about $1 million estimate there. That per foot cost is probably a little bit more than normal due to the stream that runs parallel to Mitchell Bridge Road. So there'll be additional effort there. But that was the recommendation from the user group to try to continue the effort of the pedestrian loop maps that are from the community involvement groups, and start building that out and getting improvements to the bike ped facilities in these areas. Again, a project budget number, very similar to the Lexington Road. And then just a quick stop on next steps. Of course, we have the work session tonight. You'll discuss it at your agenda meeting, and preferably, if it's all favorable to everyone, a positive vote on September 7th. And then that would allow us to move these project concepts into the preliminary plan phase of the project development process. And I'll turn it back over to Mr. Mayor for any questions.
Thanks, Derek. Input from colleagues on the commission. Jesse?
Thank you, Mayor. I guess it's gonna I have 3 questions. I mean, one of them kind of parallels earlier discussion on Lexington, but kind of sitting in the back of my mind is we've got this TSPLOST 2022 project list near on the horizon, and how some of that may dovetail with these projects. I guess I'm just throwing out there generally, I'm wondering if it makes sense to hold on this timeline until we have a better sense of what's going to be on that final project list. So what's the effect of delaying jumping on this now and waiting and seeing what funding might dovetail with these projects down the road? Because it seems to me like the money that we have for those two projects may not actually complete much sidewalk along those two roads. I mean, compared to the whole road, right? Mitchell Bridge is a very long road, and we're just talking about that stretch from Westchester to the park.
Correct. The notion to hold is, again, just we can't predict future construction costs. Everything's escalating. I know the TSPLOST 2023 program is coming along, and I believe that some of our committee members or user group members are going to submit for a project there, and I believe staff has submitted a project for as well. So I think you'll see some of those projects come forth for consideration. However, these projects also are isolated. And when I say isolated, they're you can determine a logical termini for each one of those from point A to point B, and always pick them up from the end of those. So just allowing these projects to move forward, I don't think is detrimental. And by the time you get into preliminary plans and you're developing, your additional survey work, permitting schedules, the meats and potatoes that go along with the preliminary plan development, I believe y'all will have already either determined any preconceived notion projects that you want to continue with, or have seen a list in the oversight committee would be, or the advisory committee for the SPLOST 2023 would be well underway. So I think it could dovetail very quickly in there without necessarily putting this on hold.
And so I guess put another way, Derek, if this was the only work you ever did, you'd still be gaining a community benefit. But these all stop and start at places where to pick up with not only potentially the next TSPLOST but with some federal funds that may be on their way, would also gain us some extended assets.
Yes.
Okay. I just have like two other questions, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So the second one, I mean, no doubt that the folks who live all along Mitchell Bridge, Tallahassee, and Westchester, they want to see sidewalks. I've been hearing about that loud and clear. I know Commissioner Hamby's hearing about that along Timothy. I mean, people have organized groups to really push for this. But there's something that I guess strikes me about like the Atlanta Highway bucket of money being devoted, almost entirely to these two roads that, feed into Atlanta Highway, but are essentially pedestrian projects for corridors that aren't all along or even immediately running into, in the case of Mitchell Bridge, Atlanta Highway, where we're talking about putting the sidewalk. And I guess I'm just wondering, the user group that met, like how many of the folks in that user group were residents or stakeholders along Atlanta Highway or Jennings Mill or Cleveland versus folks who lived along Timothy and Mitchell? Do we have a breakdown of that census, if you will?
I don't. I know two of them definitely live on the Mitchell Bridge, Timothy Road, out of the four residents. I can't recall off the top of my head the resident location of the other two. So I know there was two there.
Yeah, I guess I'd just be interested to know that, because I'd hate to take a SPLOST project with many people, a huge chunk of the folks who live in District 6 and 10 who live along and work along Atlanta Highway, and it's kind of on there as Atlanta Highway, and then we end up putting all the money into these two streets that are not really Atlanta Highway, even though they are absolutely needed projects. And I guess that kind of dovetails with my last question, which is, has Athens in Motion weighed in on this list as well, or like was that group looped in for feedback anywhere yet?
Yes, sir. They I don't say they participated heavily, but they were aware of the projects. I made a presentation to them when the priority list or the initial project list was developed. And I believe they are looking at their own additional list and looking for future funding for development of their program.
Okay. So did they or the SPLOST Oversight Committee have any? I know this is stuff that y'all have talked about before I joined this body, looping in Mitchell Bridge and Timothy, but to the Atlanta Highway corridor. But I mean, what's the sense they have of basically moving the entirety of this bucket into Mitchell Bridge and Timothy, as opposed to other projects that are closer to Atlanta Highway itself.
Specifically for AIM?
AIM and or the Oversight Committee. Like, did those groups have an explanation as to why they thought this made sense?
The project concept list will go to the TSPLOST Oversight Committee this month.
Okay.
So they'll make their formal recommendation there. I don't want to speak for AIM, but I think generally speaking, bike ped is good. And then I know they know the effort that's going on with the DOT projects to make some improvements. However, even though these weren't on their high tier priority list, they did not take a formal stand. That's what I'm trying to say, and I don't want to speak for them.
Okay, thanks, y'all.
All right, others on Atlanta Highway projects? Yeah, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. And maybe this, Commissioner Holt, this might help as well too. I think I understand your question about that. One of the members I was able to select to be part of this discussion is a member of AIM, actually, Athens in Motion, and from that standpoint. And I will say this in general about the bucket for Atlanta Highway. It was developed as the language in the TSPLOST language was written based on some of the studies we've had passed with the corridor. One of the studies specifically was the ULI report that was done. Derek referenced that earlier, and part of the ULI report suggested looking at the side streets like Mitchell Bridge and like Timothy Road to help Atlanta Highway. And I think also to make it more active, to make it more pedestrian, so that pedestrians can walk to the amenities that are along Atlanta Highway is their whole point, which I do think, and I think we've seen that some projects are going to be taking place here soon along Atlanta Highway that will add to the amenities, but also add to the sidewalk and bike pedestrian infrastructure along Atlanta Highway proper. Also, and as got brought up, there's several different funding. The mayor brought this up with regards to Lexington Road, and especially with Atlanta Highway and the mall, since that is the one project that the school board is wanting to participate in. I think there's even more of an opportunity for different sources of funding to come to the Atlanta Highway proper road. So I guess what I'm saying is with Atlanta Highway, you have all sorts of funding, either be TAD or state funds or federal funds. And let's not forget about the transportation bill that just passed too. Hopefully the mayor's helping get some of those dollars into our town. So you have those fundings, but really with streets like Mitchell Bridge and Timothy Road, the only thing that we have to rely on to help us do any sidewalks or bike peds stuff would be TSPLOST or property taxes. So there's that point there that I'd like to point out. But I would like to maybe do this, suggest Commissioner Holt, maybe you and I can get together before the voting session to kind of, I do agree that some of the recommendation needs a little bit tweaking, and maybe staff could also send to us some of the survey results based on each of the categories and how many people weighed in. I heard Derek talking about the sort of effort to get people to weigh in on both sides of the Lexington Highway and Atlanta Highway, and I think that might be helpful for us to look at those numbers on each of the categories there about that, because y'all did put forth a good effort in doing that, and very much appreciated. So I think that would be helpful. And maybe if Commissioner Holt and I could get together before the voting session to look at whatever tweaks could be made to this, and maybe address some concerns he might have as well. Maybe we can have a whole Hamby summit that we could work together on something here. I was about to compare it to the Nixon Khrushchev summit, but then that would make me Nixon, and I don't want to be Nixon. Definitely don't want to be Nixon. I see you, Mariah. So at any rate, Jesse,
we can stick with Hool Hamby, and I'm happy to have a summit. Yeah,
it's got a nice ring to it, also.
It does, doesn't it? So I think we can figure something out if you're agreeable to that, and then we'll go forward. So
Melissa.
Yes. I think a couple of y'all kind of touched on the question I had about potential federal funds or coming our way that could be applied to these projects. And being that Atlanta Highway is a state road, would there be potential for like double dipping into those federal funds if we get some local federal infrastructure funding for transportation and then the state has federal funds? Is that?
We're not quite there yet in terms of knowing how the recently passed through the Senate infrastructure package will be played out. Typically, those monies would come through GDOT and other state agencies, and whether they give a local allocation or those are application-based dollars is just not determined yet.
Okay, and another question I have with regards to state control of that road. From what I understand, that could cause any of these projects to be dragged out because we're relying on state approval and maybe state matching funds. Whereas with Mitchell Bridge and Timothy Road, we have total control over those roads. So, I agree that it makes sense to conquer those projects first because it's most likely we can get them done first. And the idea of approving the concept, we do this all the time. We approve a concept and we go back and amend it here and there if needed. But in getting that concept approved, it feels like it kind of gives staff the idea to like do that long range planning and get creative, for the whole entire corridor. So that's my 2 cents on the idea of prioritizing those. Does staff have any insight onto, the reality of GDOT dragging some of these projects on Atlanta Highway proper out?
I apologize, Commissioner, that when you mean dragging them out, I'm not following your.
I know we have to get approval along the way, and it can take a long time for them to do their analysis and decide whether or not they're going to match funds and stuff like that. So is my logic on the prioritization of the Mitchell and Timothy sidewalks, is that accurate?
Yes, ma'am. I would think so. Local control with local money means you can move it and you can move it forward more quickly, typically less expensive. For example, the realignment of Mitchell Bridge and Timothy and Atlanta Highway, Transportation Public Works staff they did a great job reaching out and having several conversations with DOT and getting some guidance on that. And I believe that may be may be incorrect, but those are the things that they want to bring forth, I think, as an application or a project in some of the future SPLOST programs to handle that. And again, soon as you start talking about that state or federal funding, it just kicks in all the regulatory requirements that go along with those projects, and they do take time, and they do there's a lot of resources put to bear to make those projects worthwhile. I always find the saying, free money's not free. So it's just, we have to be careful with that, I guess is what I'm saying. It does take longer than normal.
Okay, thank you.
And just to remind everybody of some already pinned timelines that the state does have, the Atlanta Highway interchange reconstruction should be having construction underway in 2023. And then the Lexington Loop interchange should be under construction very late this calendar year or in 2022. They've already completed all the property acquisition for the Lexington one, which is why you may have seen businesses like the old cabinet shop relocate. Anything else on the highway? Russell?
I'm a big supporter of multi-use paths, and I'm eager to see these expand all across our community as many places as we can possibly get them to increase the mobility of our community, increase exercise, increase the movement of children and the elderly, safety throughout the community. So I'm hoping we can just keep this train rolling and really establish a network of these multi-use paths throughout the entire county. Thank you.
Thanks, Russell. Yeah, Tim.
Just a quick question, which I know we get sometimes. If we could get a higher quality maps on this presentation, that'd be appreciated. I was trying to zoom in a little bit on the Mitchell Bridge stuff around there, and it's a little grainy as I zoom in, so that'd be appreciated.
Yes.
Yeah, I think when it gets dumped into the presentation, it sort of loses quality. So yeah, Derek, if you've got just the original, great.
Yes, sir.
Blaine?
I was just going to answer a question from earlier, but I'll wait till the commissioners are done with their questions, sir.
Yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, I just want to say if there's a list of other bike ped projects that go beyond what those recommendations were, if we could just see that in full. I feel like I recall something around Stonehenge too, but I'd just like to see where, there's some neighborhoods that might not have had as much participation in this process all along, but are also very much in need. And I'd just like to see where those projects are factored in as well, at least for future reference as we move into the next TSPLOST and start talking about leveraging federal money and TAD money. I'm hearing myself talking back, so I'm done. Someone's got me echoing.
Might be me, sorry.
It's Khrushchev, the ghost of Khrushchev.
We know about those Russians and their technology. Anyone else before Blaine follows up? Go ahead, Blaine.
And I think this is important. I appreciate the question, Commissioner Denson, so staff did not submit any corridor continuation projects for TSPLOST. Atlanta Highway Group is submitting some of the specific projects for funding, but so far they have not submitted a corridor bucket project, if you will. And the Lexington User Group has not submitted a project as of yet, although a citizen has subsequently submitted a sidewalk project on Lexington. So, if those are things that you're interested in, you have folks asking questions, just be advised of that.
All right. Anything else? All right, Derek, thanks a whole bunch. I appreciate it. You had quite a bit of material to work with, and appreciate you paring it down for us.
Thanks, sir. Thank you for having me.
All right, we're going to move on to, again, a really high-level conversation that sets up our day-long conversation we'll have a week from tomorrow about American Rescue Plan funding. We, of course, at our retreat at Bishop Park several weeks ago, began this discussion with guidance we had at the time, and we've gotten a little bit more federal direction, and so I'm going to turn it over to Blaine.
Thank you, Mayor. And one last thing on the TSPLOST, if I just remind everybody that the deadline for resident submissions is this Sunday. All right, I'll share my screen. And, a lot going on in the community, a lot of opportunity. I felt like this was a good opportunity to, it keeps doing that. In the last few weeks, as we still await final Treasury guidance, there's information in the news about a potential infrastructure bill. Folks are trying to figure out, without the benefit of the final guidance, what all this means. The TSPLOST processes are moving. I think there's sufficient confusion in certain areas of the community that perhaps maybe some decisions are already being made and folks are being left out. I did talk to Mayor Gertz about, in lieu of, the retreat we were talking about last week, to really focus on some specifics around this. So I'm going to do a very high-level presentation, not take too much time, and hopefully folks, if they'll just, this is what we know now, and this is the most that we've really figured out, and then we'll have the conversation with the commission next week. So I'm just going to talk very quickly about eligible activities that are broadly been offered. The timeline, not of a local process to designate those funds, but just in general, what we know what's going on with the rescue plan. We've talked about before at a retreat about a very specific process that we could go through, not unlike our SPLOST processes, but that and like our SPLOST processes, the commission may want to designate some potential areas of funding. We may not want to go through that elaborate process, and we can talk about that as well. Just some general questions to consider, and for residents to consider as well as they, as we all deliberate over how best to make these funds have a lasting impact on our community. And then just whatever process that you decide to pursue in taking the money we've received and prioritizing it for certain things in the community, certain hallmarks of a process everybody should, maybe expect that we should follow. So again, just things that we could spend these funds on. This is straight out of the interim Treasury guidance, supporting any public health response to the COVID emergency, replacing our revenue loss in the public sector, any negative economic impacts, either that's businesses, residents, business revenue loss, eviction, rental assistance, things of those natures, premium pay for essential workers, infrastructure, of course, is whether that's water, sewer, stormwater, or broadband, are all allowable under the American Rescue Act. So just so everybody understands, and I've also heard some feedback from folks in the public about reports that are due, and that would somehow drive early, quick decisions. But the fact is that the final Treasury guidance on, exactly how we can use these funds and what we're supposed to do has not been published yet. And so, this has been out here for several months. There's been a lot in the news. Folks may feel like we're either behind the curve or we've already made decisions and are moving forward. But the fact is, when the Congress passes legislation, they ask the federal rulemakers, in this case the Treasury, to fill in the specifics on what needs to be done, and that's usually put out for public comment. And that ended just less than a month ago, and we hope that by September 1st we'll get this final Treasury guidance. Doesn't mean that we can't start talking about it. We have received some interim guidance. We have a pretty good idea, but just wanted folks to not get the impression that we're sitting on our hands or that somehow we're missing opportunity here. The interim report, there's a couple reports that we have to provide. There are different reports required of the metro governments who are larger. And so I just want to be clear. We do have something that's due August 31st, but it's simply to reflect any spending that we've done. We've not had any spending at this point. And then going forward, if you've received more than $5 million in funding, starting on October the 31st and 30 days after the end of each ensuing quarter, we have to tell the government how we've spent the funds. So that's the general reporting that we have to do, for the federal government. We also have our finance director, David Boyd, on here. David, before I leave that slide, is there anything else that you care to add to that?
No, I think you summed it up here. I mean, the interim report, in addition to reporting any expenditures that you have through August 31st, of which we have none, we also have to put in our formula that we use to calculate our revenue loss, and we use the GFOA calculator. And so we'll have to put that in for the Treasury, tell them how much we've calculated, and then they'll have that information with them.
And I also want to assure all of y'all, what's being put out is being read by our staff, and we're trying to understand it. We wouldn't think that the final guidance would be a huge leap from what we've read thus far, and it doesn't mean that we can't start planning. So just know that we're paying attention and following through with these things. So, just listening to some folks and talking with the mayor, and Mayor Gertz, you may want to speak to this as well.
Yeah.
But there are some, funding areas that the commission may want to signal that we would like to spend funds along these areas. So, Mayor, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Manager Williams. Just thinking about the kind of rarity but gravity of the funding that we have in front of us, and many of our multi-year strategic commitments and how they dovetail with this. I recognize that we've got some partnerships already underway that may be able to be heightened and emphasized. Youth development is a key one in participation with the Clarke County School District, who, of course, we're meeting with on the 23rd of this month, as well as with a broad array of community-based nonprofits and organizations. Homeless supports, obviously, we have this pending strategic plan, and we've got what appears to be a very collaborative coalition. Affordable housing kind of already has the GIC entity that has coalesced around identifying our community needs and responding to those. And then we've been great partners with a number of entities around disadvantaged business supports. And I think we have some good opportunities there. And of course, we've talked about employee premium pay and public health supports. You'll be seeing a very, very small scale collaborative with the Northeast Health District to do vaccine incentivization for a vote next Tuesday. And then on the infrastructure front, probably prior to this week, I would have suggested maybe some broadband, but given both that the state has a portal open for broadband and that there's around $65 billion of broadband funding in the infrastructure package that still has to pass the House, I would recommend deferring that for the time. But those are some initial thoughts just for everybody to be mulling in the next week before we meet on Friday.
Thanks, Mayor. And I did include the infrastructure in here with a point to make with that. Sorry, let me skip ahead. So there's the local recovery funds. The state has received, a couple of tranches of state recovery funds. And a little less than a month ago, the state announced that they were going to make available to localities to apply under these the same general cost, the eligible areas that I discussed just a little earlier, accepting revenue replacement and premium pay. So really around negative economic relief and infrastructure. And so I've heard y'all say that you want to try and preserve, funds for the purposes that we can use to help support the community. So obviously, to the mayor's point, we're going to be looking to the infrastructure bill. As we discussed on Tuesday night, the broadband project, we intend, and that's one thing we'll be asking you to do Tuesday night, is approve an application for some of these state recovery funds, which, by the way, is due August 31st. And Mayor and Commission, I'd like to also, I'll send you some additional ideas that staff is working on to apply for these state funds. And those would include, along the infrastructure lines, and I want to be clear, we're not suggesting that be used with the local allocation, the $57 million, but we're looking to try and draw down some additional state funds for those eligible categories. For instance, our reuse system that we're considering with public utilities, where we, take the reclaimed water and we put in a pipe that goes out to the industrial area. And we sell that water to them, which is a very good conservation move and could be helpful to the industries as well. That would include a pump and a pipe, and that could be $6 or $7 million that we would, try and get that from the state instead of, suggesting that it come from the $57 million here. Likewise, stormwater projects. You've heard us talk about the live stream replacement program and the culverts that need to be replaced. And you recently added some 2011 money in there to bridge the gap to TSPLOST. Well, we should ask and try and get as much money from the state as we could to do that. There are some water quality things that the state would like to see. We could use SPLOST funds to help make our application to the state for those infrastructure funds more competitive. And so, there are several projects that we'd like to, I'll give to you before the weekend to consider on the short grant turnaround that we may ask you to approve on Tuesday for submission prior to the grant deadline to see if we can draw down some additional funds from the state along these infrastructure lines. So, go ahead.
Melissa, you had a question?
Yeah, I had seen some guidance that suggested that these funds could be used for relief of utility reliefs, like helping folks pay back water bills and sewer and garbage bills, probably. Have you seen any of that guidance?
Yes.
Okay, because
that
I
would go
am
under.
Interested in assuring that we do make a program like that available.
Absolutely. And Mayor, I think that's the intent, to talk about what's possible. You know, it's going to take more than a 20 or 30-minute presentation to really get through that. And Commissioner Link hear exactly that type of feedback about what you think is important. There's a lot of worthy things to pursue here. And, you know, we were just talking today, Mayor, about affordable housing. And, you know, the Bethel project has taken $39 million pretty quickly. It's a huge transformational project, but there's going to take some deliberation to make sure that we cast these funds in areas that you feel are important for the community. Well, hallmarks of a process to consider, we would offer, obviously consistent with, compliant with the grant, the final guidance. You know, early on when this was coming out, you know, the federal government signaled that, you know, in addition to consideration of equity in addressing needs, that hopefully there'd been some citizen input in the or citizen engagement with certain projects, and certainly we've got some plans and studies that, you know, are waiting to be funded. You know, prioritization of benefits to those most in need in our community. So, like we just said, for y'all to help tell us what's the most important, and have resident engagement input into that as well. So these are just some things as we talk about putting together a process next week together and a timeline, things to keep in mind.
I have a quick question about process, but then also a particular thing from the last slide on process. We received an email from Mayor Gertz, I think it was last Friday, his like little weekly update regarding some public health outreach initiatives that I think we're voting on pretty soon. If I recall correctly, yeah, that's going to come up for vote on Tuesday. And so, can we in general expect with like designated projects that they will kind of come forward? First of all, would that then be classified as, you know, quote unquote a designated project, given that ahead of a public input process that has come to us as one of our priorities for funding?
It would. This pilot is a $250,000 expenditure, so it's less than 0.5% of the bucket. So,
sure. Yeah.
Yes, it's sort of a unique need, obviously, given the kind of gravity of vaccination at the moment. With the others, I would expect a longer deliberation period and gestation and identifying. You know, let's say if we're going to talk about homelessness, you know, we've got the coalition who's putting together that strategic plan as we speak, and so we would want that fully baked and come to us.
Okay, and so we can expect with other designated projects to take a little bit longer, but for it to come forward in somewhat of a piecemeal process rather than us approving a package of designated projects at a certain point.
Yeah. So, for example, I would imagine that, say, the disadvantaged business package wouldn't come exactly at the same time as the homeless package, but we may be setting aside X number of millions of dollars for that category generally.
Okay. And will those recommendations ordinarily be staff generated or mayor directed, or as commissioners, if we're having really robust conversations in our communities, and, you know, we have for a year and a half now about what some of the needs are, will there be opportunity for us to bring things forward? Like, what can we anticipate that to look like?
Absolutely. What I'll say broadly is that what I would seek in any of these is as completely collaborative an environment as possible.
Sure.
You know, what we don't want to see is this $58 million atomized. So, you know, we're splitting it up into $30,000 and $50,000 chunks, but rather getting bigger, more substantial things where there are a lot of collaborators around the table with those. So, for example, if we were to do a youth development project with ourselves, CCSD, and a consortium of youth support agencies in the community, that would be a model. Or if we were to do homeless work through the coalition, that's 20-member entity with lots of organizations, that would be a similar deal.
Okay. for example, I was just thinking about, as a part of the budget, we had sort of looked ahead towards allocating money both towards youth development and with regards to public health supports. In my district, the community garden pilot that sort of addresses issues of food insecurity and community violence that we've, throughout the pandemic, but particularly in the springtime, we're reflecting a lot on. And so if there would be an opportunity for us to, in addition to youth development, where you kind of identified that we have partners at the table already who we've been collaborating with around that. With regards to the ladder project, if there might be an opportunity for me to formalize some of that discussion and formalize some of those steps forward that were sort of put on hold after the budget process in the weeks to come, since it is something that we have been talking about a lot since, May or June.
Definitely. And one thing we may want to also consider, and again, this is something that we want to spend more time on next Friday, might be something kind of akin to CDBG service category expenditures, in that we may want to say, hey, there are just some projects that are really important, but they don't fit neatly into these buckets. Maybe we want to take 15 or 20% of the overall package for those smaller scale or more unique projects.
Sure.
Or those that may be kind of grassroots driven.
Okay, cool. And then my second set of tranche of questions pertain particularly to the public health outreach project. If it's appropriate to discuss now, I know we're going to probably talk about it on Tuesday, but the more exposure the public has, the better, I think. And so I was wondering if, because I kind of earlier this year ran my own vaccine outreach program and learned a lot from that experience. I do think having trusted messengers for that outreach is really important, and the neighborhood leaders certainly bring that. I wondered how, if you all could speak a little bit to how that program sort of came together with regards to them being the street, the messengers of the trying to get the word out about the vaccines, et cetera. If that came from DPH, I'll go ahead and say I asked because I feel like I really appreciate the work of the neighborhood leaders. I feel like we pile a lot onto them oftentimes, and wondered if in this allocation there was included some additional compensation for this extra work that they're taking on. But first question is, how do we get there? How did we get here with this, the way that this program is currently looking?
So with this pilot partnership, again, $250,000 proposal with the Northeast Health District of the Department of Public Health, they'd expressed the frustration that I think all health authorities have with low vaccination rates, and are able to understand by age band where that is. Fortunately, their geographic breadth in the community includes the site on Harris and Hancock, their partnership with Athens Neighborhood Health on McKinley Drive, and then the two Teen Matters clinics on Rock Springs and on Cedar Shoals Drive. And so the goal would be to use those 4 static sites as well as a series of pop-up locations, and with those static sites being adjacent to both a lot of youth and to communities in high medical need, they've been able to partner with a UGA department, curiously enough, the Department of Religion, that received a grant for a multicultural team of outreach agents. So I think this 15-member team that the UGA department has been able to draw down would be force multipliers in terms of really knocking on doors block by block and telling folks, hey, right now and tomorrow, you can go get paid to get your vaccine just up the block. Please go do that. And targeting those communities that we know have the greatest need for vaccination. So that's a little thumbnail sketch.
Yeah, so the geographical emphasis made sense to me, but given that the neighborhood leaders are sort of spread out across all the elementary school zones, I guess it was unclear to me how that interfaces are just ones that are just the neighborhood leaders who are focused on those geographic areas will be enlisted for this project.
So the neighborhood leaders have not been engaged yet around this.
Okay,
it would probably be a secondary or maybe even tertiary support. Obviously, the school year has just begun, and so they've got a lot on their plate. But we do have this 15-member team.
Gotcha.
The Department of Religion grant has funded.
Okay, and we can discuss that more on Tuesday. But I just had some preliminary questions since this is the first the public might be hearing about that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And if I might, just, Mayor, repeat what I, just so the folks understand. So there's, I think trying to do this piecemeal will be confusing and come at the expense of transparency. And it could be that, as the mayor suggested, that you create several areas that you intend to spend money and put a portion of the money towards that and be very clear about that. And then I think, Mayor, what you were saying is then how those funds are allocated would come at different rates, because you might pursue disadvantaged business supports a little bit quicker than affordable housing just due to the nature of the program. But I think it would be important, if you did signal, because for instance, the 250,000, if somebody's not paying attention to this, they'll think, oh, it's starting, things are about to be spent and I'm going to miss my opportunity to participate or be heard or share my idea. And I think we want to avoid that if we can. And I think the clearer you signal, these are the priorities that we have for the community, and here's the approximate amount we'd like to put against those, with details to come about how to get those funds into the community. The mayor is suggesting that you use some folks that are already working in those areas, or leverage the funds that we have with other entities. And that's all, we'll hash all that out next Friday at the retreat, I think is the intent. Just a few, this last slide really, questions to consider as we go through all of this for you. What data do we have for establishing goals for the funding? What populations are being affected, and underserved is something that rings very clear through the federal guidance. How do we want to engage the public in this process so that they feel like they understand what's happening and have the opportunity to share their thoughts at appropriate times? What are the long-term operational impacts after we spend this money? Do we create a lot of programs that all of a sudden when the money's gone, we either have to fund or they dry up? What are the impacts to the community if we do that? And then how do we measure once this has come and gone what we've truly done for the community? And so I think that's very important for us all to understand. This is a rare opportunity. In my career, I've never seen this happen. And so as the elected representatives, you have the responsibility, authority to sign these funds and make an impact on the community. And we want to be able to measure that as we go so that we can communicate that back to the residents. Mayor, that's all I had, unless there are any other questions about that. We look forward to next Friday.
Any other questions?
Mr.
Yeah,
Mayor?
Russell.
I'd like to, again, just reiterate the development of infrastructure throughout the community is a great way to spend these funds, and in particular, multi-use paths. The more we establish a network of multi-use paths, the more enriching a life we can give to our youth. If we can connect a neighborhood via multi-use path to the library, to their school, to sports fields, where kids no longer have to depend on cars or a parent that's available to take them somewhere, we're going to be enriching the lives of our youth. So I love how simple multi-use paths can be. We build them, they serve the entire community. They become an engine for economic growth. They become an engine for better living, better exercise, better health outcomes. We've seen how much these paths get used throughout the pandemic. So let's do it. Thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner. I think there's a Woody Guthrie song just waiting to provide a soundtrack to you there. Commissioner Davenport.
Thank you, Mayor. I pray that my colleagues next Friday, I pray that my colleagues next Friday will focus on affordable housing and premium pay for our county employees, just to help with morale. And, affordable housing has like a ripple effect of positive impacts in our community. And I echo Commissioner Edwards' sentiments about infrastructure. It's very important as well. So thank you, guys.
Tim.
Hey, Mayor. I'm definitely interested in doing the premium pay for essential workers. They deserve it. And while we definitely agree with infrastructure, I think it was a good point was made earlier on that we are going to have a lot of infrastructure funding potentially coming from the state and the federal government because of the new infrastructure bill. So I think thinking about infrastructure, but maybe the kind of stuff that's not going to have, that we're not going to be able to use from those funding buckets that we know are coming down the line. And because I think that this funding bucket is a little bit unique in some ways. And something I would love us to consider and possibly try to find a way to work around is I've heard from some child care service providers, and also from some folks at the state level who work with child care. And one of the big things they're concerned about is that there is funding coming to help families pay for childcare, which is fantastic, but there's not the capacity to actually offer more childcare. And so I think there was a simple idea that I heard that was floating around of coming up with a way to be able to do some kind of subsidy for childcare workers with the childcare providers so that they can build out their staff larger, and thinking about that, making sure that wherever we do it here is sustainable, almost treating it a little bit like a challenge grant. So while it does increase the pay for those childcare providers' employees over the next few years, it's kind of on a challenge grant idea that they will then take on that increased salary point after the ARP funds are no longer applicable. But again, just thinking about that, because that is a multi-generational approach that's going to help people be able to get back to work, adults, but also give quality care to youth that can then have even better lives moving on. So I think that's something we need to kind of think about here.
Jesse, then back to Mariah.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I agree that type of infrastructure is something we need more to invest in. I don't agree that this is the best bucket to be using to fund infrastructure, given the incoming infrastructure bill, but also just because it's easier for us as a government to fund capital projects than it is for us to fund operations. And it's also easier for us to fund multi-use paths a bit at a time, which doesn't give us the kind of huge network that I think we'd all like to get to as soon as possible. But there are other huge capital investments that can be very transformative that you need all the money at once to really commit to. And, you know, largely what that's been so far in this community is a jail and a courthouse. And I'd love to see us think very transformatively about where else we can invest in something big and different that'll have a major impact for generations to come. And specifically, I really agree with the sentiments I've heard expressed by some colleagues around affordable housing as the major priority in my mind. It's that and youth development. And I think both of those dovetail with the issues of homelessness. You know, homelessness isn't just like a single issue. So I think of housing as being primarily about helping those with the most need first. So I'd love to see us look at those as where we prioritize funding, more than filling the gaps, so to speak, or you know, augmenting the kind of programming that we've been able to already get going as a government, and can continue through TSPLOST and things. Sorry, something totally caught in my throat there. Sorry about that. I did have, I guess, just a couple questions. The first was about hazard pay and or the employee bump, and I'm just curious a few specifics around that. The first is, can we apply that to people who don't work directly for us, such as the neighborhood leaders, if it's a program that we've funded, or are we restricted to only giving that to direct employees of ACC?
You're not restricted to direct employees of ACC, but there are definitions in the guidance about what's considered essential.
Okay.
With respect to the pandemic.
Okay. So then along those lines, I guess I'd really like us to find a way as soon as possible to get that to the workers who are still working for us and who worked through the pandemic. We made some very bold budgetary decisions I'm really proud of regarding wages, but I know that's also contributed to the sense many on our staff have of, you know, maybe not making as much as they're worth. I think all of our workers are worth more than they get paid here, and we're losing a lot of great talent to communities that for one reason or another pay more, or for a private sector that pays more. And so I feel like it's important for us to, as soon as possible, do what we can with this money to help the folks who showed up through extremely frightening times to keep the water and sewer running, and to, you know, keep the buses running, and to keep the solid waste pickup going, and all these other kind of essential jobs that we know to be very high risk, and some that we know now might not be as high risk, but really seemed like it at the time. You know, being in an office to greet people was kind of terrifying for a while. And there were people who weren't able to work remotely. So anybody who just showed up to work and couldn't work remotely and can be considered essential through those guidelines, I think it's important to use these funds for that. And then my question around operational funding. So can we fund a position, say, that's like a 10-year project or a 5-year project up front, even though that money won't, like, let's say we're hiring someone to work for 5 years for us with ARP money, but we only hire them 2 years from now. That extends beyond the 4-year deadline, but it's allocated before the 4-year deadline. Would that still meet the requirements?
Well, I'll tell you generally my understanding, and David can fill in the gaps for me because he's watched a lot of webinars up to this point. So our understanding is that the funds have to be either spent or committed by the end of 2024. And particularly with infrastructure, you can go beyond that a couple of years to the end of 26. It could be for other purposes as well, but not beyond that. David, would you say anything different than that?
No, I agree with you. I don't think there's a general guidance from the Treasury as to what obligated means at the end of 2024. I mean, in the normal finance world, that would mean capital projects. You know, you've got a contract and so forth, but you know, no one knows yet. Does that mean services too? So right now, I would assume without that knowledge that we can only cover services primarily through the end of 2024. But with the final guidance, you know, that may change.
Okay.
Well, if I might, and I'll just say, Commissioner Houle, you know, with regards to premium pay, I think once the commission has decided the relative areas it wants to spend funding and allocated some amounts to that, you know, we can certainly provide a path to implementing those. And that would be one that would be implemented quicker than, say, affordable housing because it's just more complex. So that's just up to y'all to direct us on what you'd like to, how much you'd like to spend on that.
Commissioner Houle, can I ask a question real quick before we move on to Manager Blaine? So we get one, before we move on to the next subject, because this was a question I was going to ask. There's 2 buckets. We get 1 bucket, then we get 2nd bucket. According to David, all of that has to be spent by the end of 2024 or 2026. Did I hear that correctly?
So the deadline,
by the end of 24.
Yeah. And then you have to have it obligated, the funds that you haven't spent. So for instance, I think what they're recognizing, let's say that you want to spend it on a very complex project, and let's say it's water and sewer, and it's tough to turn those around within 3 years. So at least the way that we're reading the guidance right now, if in good faith been moving towards that and you've obligated the funds for the construction of that water and sewer project, then you really have until the end of 26 to spend it. Now, you might ask, well, does that apply to affordable housing or certain programs? That's where we're going to need to dig in the guidance when it comes out. David, would you agree?
Yeah, I agree with that at this point in time.
Did that answer your question, Commissioner Davenport?
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt, Commissioner Houle. I just wanted to make sure. So, yes, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Can I just share one final thought and then I'm all done?
Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I appreciate your question, Commissioner Davenport. I thought that was great. Yeah, I guess basically where I'm at is I'm hoping that as soon as we get that guidance, we can revisit this discussion. I'll use permanent supportive housing as my example. If we're able to fund not only the building of the buildings, but we can also obligate certain positions to be the staffing there too. You know, we know that staffing is that really hard thing to fund, and it's really hard for us to find sources of funding as a local government for that. So I'd just be really curious to see how possible that is once we get that guidance. And I really appreciate those questions at the end of the slideshow. I thought they were great, and I'll just kind of echo those to say that designing those jobs in a way where they're measurable outcomes if achieved, essentially render their jobs obsolete is, I think, the best we can do with this, so kind of this imagined idea in the nonprofit world that if you do your job really well, then your nonprofit doesn't have to exist anymore, although that rarely actually happens. But maybe if we can take a stab at trying to design whatever we do that way, that's the way I'd like to go.
Thanks, Jesse. Back to Mariah, then Melissa.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple of final thoughts. I think it feels like we're doing our little go around. We're kind of, everybody chimes in with what they're thinking. So, couple thoughts of mine. If we could, again, as I kind of referenced earlier, move on what we agreed upon in June as soon as we can, with regards to projects that before we had sort of settled on the idea of designation, all agreed that we did want ARP money spent towards. That being said, Kelly, I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on your understanding of when we might have something available to discuss, maybe in a work session, if not something to bring forward for a vote with regards to youth development. At least in this first stage, I do think in general, with a lot of community engagement that's necessary to figure out what priorities within the umbrella of youth development are worth are important to fund. But this collaboration that you have referenced in several conversations around youth development, Mayor, if you could tell us a little bit about when you expect some sort of deliverable with regards to shape and structure that we as a body and the public can start to chew on.
So on that August 23rd meeting with CCSD, we'll talk about it there. And I've got a very high level one pager that I can send to the body in tomorrow's kind of weekly wrap up meeting.
Cool. Yeah. So if we can move on those things, whenever, if we're looking at, next steps, I think we all here, kind of gave the green light on getting some of that stuff up and running. So if we could look towards when we make that happen. I also had considered the possibility of expanding. I don't know where it's at now, but the capacity building pilot that HCD presented on earlier this spring. Gosh, it feels like it's been so long ago. But this opportunity to perhaps expand that, the bucket of funds for that, so that we can perhaps get more organizations involved or increase the funding levels for organizations to take part, so that we also use this opportunity to not only help people in the community, but transform some organizations that are doing that work and could benefit from some growth and development, so that post-pandemic, post-ARP, they're positioned to continue doing their work at a higher level. I just wanted to throw that out there as an idea to everyone. And then my last thing is that I wondered if perhaps the manager could elaborate on the definition of infrastructure that's given in this guidance. My understanding, there's been a lot of talk about like what is infrastructure at the federal level recently. My understanding is that the federal infrastructure bill that passed the Senate earlier this week, a lot of the social infrastructure spending got cut out when we talked about things like elder care, child care, some of what the Commissioner Ensign was bringing up with regards to child care, for example, may not be in that latter bill, but could potentially fit under this umbrella here. But I was wondering if there were any further specifications on what counts as infrastructure that might inform the way we lean with regards to infrastructure spending here.
Thank you, Commissioner Parker. And if I might, on the nonprofit capacity building, if the group's open to this, we can talk about that. As you know, that was placed on hold, and it was supposed to come back up at this next cycle. And I had thought we really hadn't gotten a feedback on what to change, if any. And so maybe next Friday we can talk about that program as well and get your feedback and see if we move that forward. With regards to infrastructure, and I do apologize, y'all. I'm not as up to speed on where the infrastructure bill is, and of course, it's still being negotiated with the House, I believe. For the purposes of the funds that we have received, infrastructure is related to water and sewer projects, broadband projects, and there are some qualifiers there. And what we presented on Tuesday night was consistent with that compliance and guidance about what we're trying to achieve with those funds. And then stormwater was also added in there too. Okay. There's nothing about roads or anything like that, and nothing about social infra. The things that you talk about with elder care, as much as that's related to the pandemic and negative economic impact or public health benefit, all of those things should be eligible, or at least worth talking about. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
That is, yeah, it's helpful to know kind of like what was bullet pointed. As well, I think, a lot of my fellow commissioners have brought up affordable housing. I think one of the economic impacts of the pandemic was certainly felt within the real estate market. And so addressing some of those realities for what that's meant for renters or homeowners in Athens, or folks that are already struggling to find a place to rent affordably or, live ahead of the pandemic. I think the opportunities we have here to transform those underlying conditions that made the pandemic so much worse for certain segments of the population is important. And housing, I think, is certainly a form of social infrastructure. So hopefully we can continue thinking about that too. I definitely echo some of my colleagues that have brought that forward as a priority. But yeah, that's all I got. Thank you.
Well, if I might too, just along those lines, there are a lot of different ways to interpret, the pandemic impact and mitigating that. For instance, one that's not even talked about, like if there's cost associated with decreasing the backlog in the courts, that's eligible. Building stronger neighborhoods and communities. If you want to build some outside facilities that help people socially and mitigate, encourage youth development, the parks and things of that nature. So there's a lot that we can go through there, a lot of possibility.
Yeah, Melissa.
Yes. I share some of the concerns about the infrastructure portion of spending these funds when we do have enterprise funds and we do have kind of plans to pay for some of these and the ability to borrow to pay for some of it. I'd really like this money on the front end to go into investing in the kind of things that we can't typically use or any state money, and things that are prohibited because of the gratuities clause. So I'd like to see us kind of fund programming over capital investments, unless those capital investments also have an element of, assisting homelessness or affordable housing or building entrepreneurship. And I'd love to see us invest in real estate that supports those. Existing properties, possibly in historic districts that are being underutilized or neglected, and particularly in downtown, where we can use this to kind of diversify our downtown, create affordable space for minority-owned businesses and creative culture businesses that are basically no longer have a presence downtown. Maybe using upper floors for affordable housing. I can think of at least 2 buildings, one of which is vacant, the other which is partially vacant and being maintained by tenants that are in historic districts. I'd love to see us use this to kind of not just invest in affordable housing, but invest in community, invest in our culture, and invest in diversifying that culture, and which leads to social capital to really make what is kind of the centerpiece of our town reflective of the true diversity of our town, and a place where all people can feel comfortable visiting, working, starting a business, and living.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, Jesse.
Thank you, Mayor. Just wanted to think, it's kind of parallel to ARP, although it's definitely related. I know a lot of what we passed in our budget is putting a lot of new and extra work on Housing and Community Development Department. And I imagine a lot of what we're talking about here may add further to that. So I just ask management to share with us sooner than later if there's a need in that department for us to make a budget amendment or something to fund additional staffing, or to otherwise help equip that department to succeed at all the work that we've given them and maybe likely to give them further. I would love to hear that need as clearly and as soon as possible and figure out a way to set us all up to succeed. So
I really appreciate that, Commissioner Houle, and certainly we're very interested to hear, both the intent of how you intend to allocate the funds, the impacts, the outcomes that you seek, the processes by which you want to deliberate and get citizen input, and then we would come back to you with some recommendations about how to appropriately resource and staff that. So I appreciate that comment.
Anyone else want to leave us with some thoughts to kind of mull for our meeting next Friday? All right, good input, everybody. I really appreciate it. All right, last item tonight for tonight's meeting is the initial round of thoughts around requests for our General Assembly delegation on the calendar for the second Tuesday in September is a meeting with delegation members. And so tonight is not the final opportunity, but I thought the way we could best use the time tonight is sort of brainstorming and just everybody kind of throw out their thoughts. And then over the next month, we can refine this prior to direct engagement with General Assembly members. So I'm just going to run down the list 1 through 10, and I'll begin with Commissioner Davenport.
The only thing I would like to request from our delegates is just to work with us, communicate with us. Even though we don't always agree, we still have a community of residents who have concerns, and those are the same residents that either vote for you or don't vote for you. So just work with us.
All right. Commissioner Parker.
No thoughts at this time for me. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Melissa.
Things that might actually could get done.
That's a great framing of it. I like that. Things that might actually could get done.
Expanding our downtown development district, since our downtown has expanding the size of the ADDA board, which has not been expanded. Actually, the language around the makeup of it hasn't been changed since we were separate entities, Athens and Clarke County. So that, and again, we ask for this every year, but giving more local control over speeding and radar type stuff, and how we set speed limits on our streets. I'm sure there's other stuff too that's slipping my mind right now, but I'll keep it. I'll definitely throw some stuff out there.
I just thought of something if I can.
Yeah. Jump right in.
I just remembered the work of the Justice and Memory team. They've been very interested in getting some refined direction regarding the gratuities clause. So that might be something that we could ask them to consider.
And I know that one member of our delegation is very interested in that, given his other hat. Good idea. Tim.
Thank you, Mayor. And just the broken record. I've got one. I'm just simplifying. Low-income homestead exemption. We've got it written. It's ready. And we've gotten close last year. And so to build on that, to make us even better set up for success, I think it might be helpful for us to discuss what we'd be willing to roll into that for a general homestead exemption increase, which I know some of the delegation is interested in, and just coming up to an amount that this body is willing to swallow as a compromise to get the low-income homestead exemption finally in place this coming session.
I already have a maximum pill size that I have in mind. I think I could swallow a $2,000 homestead exemption increase to move us from 10 to 12, but I think that's the biggest pill that your mayor is interested in swallowing. So if you want a direct response to that, I give it to you.
That's around the same pill size that I was thinking. And I know that's what I've heard some of the fellow commissioners talk about also. So I think that maybe that could be our maximum number there. Yeah.
Right. Jesse.
Thank you, Mayor. I liked the might actually could. I picked up might could over time living here, but now might actually could is a new one.
That northeastern derivation.
Yeah. So in my mind, the same list that we had is kind of, let's just copy paste, but they did give us one of the things we asked for, number 5 on that list. The election bill that I wasn't, very pleased with overall did include shoring up the law around special weird circumstances in elections when someone's no longer eligible. So with that, I would like to just basically suggest the same list with a heavy, bold, really the most important emphasis being exactly what Commissioner Denson spoke to, the homestead exemption. That to me is by far the biggest and most important one. I would suggest if we're going to add something in place of the one that we knocked off that list, I forget, was Medicaid expansion on our list? We took it off, right?
We took it off, kind of recognizing that it had broad applicability.
I would like to suggest putting it back on, specifically because there are huge tranches of ARP money that we are ineligible for as a state and a locality because we are not a Medicaid expansion state.
Some of the early chatter. Oh, go ahead.
I mean, the argument all along has been we're missing out on funds, but now there's even more funds in this crisis situation. So it feels particularly relevant to me to reintroduce that to the list, perhaps.
Some of the chatter around the 3.5 million not bipartisan bill in Washington would be this supplement for those states that haven't expanded Medicaid. So just a note about what may be coming down the pike there.
Okay. That's helpful to know. I'll retain my suggestion though. I guess if we're talking about the size of that pill, I feel like I'm choking on any size pill. I'm not real interested in that, but maybe y'all can convince me that we can compromise a little bit there. I feel like we already have a very high homestead exemption here in Clarke County, so
the highest in the region.
Yep. So I feel like that should already speak for itself, and it's really looking out for the low-income folks that are suffering the worst of gentrification. But just another thing that I imagine is going to be part of this discussion is redistricting. I don't think anyone brought that up yet, but a discussion with them about us submitting our maps for them to work from, and maybe we as a body can discuss what we want those maps to look like. I'd like to see us carve time out for that. Thanks.
All right, no, that's good. Thank you. Russell.
I'd like to see us explore working with a nonpartisan map drawing body that could draw our maps for us, and then we could submit that to our delegation for adoption to sort of avoid the malevolent actions of yesteryear that capriciously restructured our government. I have a sneaking suspicion that something like that might be in the offing this coming cycle. Thanks.
I'd like a cycle with no capricious behavior nor malevolence. And Commissioner Hamby and I were subject to said malevolence, so I feel you. And speaking of which, Commissioner Hamby. I think Commissioner Hamby's out getting some herbs for you, Commissioner Parker.
Some herbs?
He must have been inspired by Khrushchev.
Oregano, everyone watching, oregano.
Right. We're talking we're talking health enhancing things for one and one's child.
Don't get it twisted, okay?
Yes, no. Thanks for specifying. All right. Anything else for the good of the group?
Mayor, can I ask a clarifying question to Commissioner Edwards? Because Commissioner Edwards was saying what I think he was saying. I think this is a genius idea. Commissioner Edwards, are you saying that we should lead by example here and Athens-Clarke County should create its own nonpartisan redistricting commission?
Yes.
I think that's a fantastic, inspired idea. And I would love for staff to be working on that and working with the Board of Elections to see how they could work to get that commission created. Yeah.
And we happen to have some map making experts just up the street on the corner of Millage and Hancock. Yeah, Commissioner Davenport.
No, excellent idea, Commissioner Denson and Edwards. Can you give us a timeline for redistricting from the state level? Aren't they going into session in September?
It looks like a little bit later than that. So, in fact, I'll be sending notes tomorrow in my weekly wrap up. I was in Savannah this weekend for GMA and did hear the chief of staff for Speaker Ralston mention that it's looking like November, December, given that census numbers just came out today and they've got some work to do ahead of that. So it's a couple months down the road. And there's a little bit of discussion about potentially local legislation being allowed to be in this special session of the General Assembly. Although, of course, the regular session of the General Assembly will start less than a month after the special session, planned for 3 weeks, would conclude.
Thank you.
You got it. All right. All right. Good work, everyone. Thank you much. Thanks for playing double duty with work sessions this week. Everybody have a great night. Look for my memo tomorrow and look forward to seeing you on Tuesday at agenda setting.
Night.
Thanks,
Night.
Al. Bye.